The wind came first, sweeping low across the Wyoming plains, like a warning that no mercy lived out here. Not in the land, not in the sky, and certainly not in the hearts of men who learned early that softness got you buried. Daniel Hart stood on the porch of his ranch house with his coat collar turned up, watching dust spiral along the fence line, his boots planted on weathered boards worn smooth by decades of lonely pacing. At 42, Daniel had the look of a man carved by silence, broad shoulders, a face roughened by sun and regret, eyes that rarely lingered on anything that might ask something of him. His ranch stretched farther than the eye could see, yet it felt smaller every year, emptier, like the echo inside his chest after his wife's grave had closed over a decade ago. He had stopped expecting anything from the world except work, drought, and the slow ticking of time toward nothing in particular. That was why, when he saw a small figure standing by the main gate just before dusk, he assumed at first it was another trick of loneliness. No one came this far unless they were lost, desperate, or dangerous. As the figure stepped closer, the illusion broke. It was a woman, thin as a shadow, holding the hand of a little girl whose steps lagged. Her head bowed, as if the ground itself were too heavy to lift her gaze from. The woman's coat was too light for the season, her shoes worn nearly through, her dark hair tied back with care that spoke of pride, surviving longer than comfort ever could. She stopped at the gate, hesitant, like someone approaching a wild animal they hoped was tired of biting. Daniel didn't move at first. Experience had taught him that mercy had a price, and he had paid enough in his lifetime. Still, something in the way the woman stood, straight-backed despite exhaustion, chin lifted despite fear, kept him rooted to the porch. When she finally spoke, her voice carried across the open land, accented, careful, as though each English word had been counted before release. She said his name like a question, then said she was sorry to trouble him, then fell silent, as if the rest required more courage than she possessed. Daniel descended the steps slowly, each footfall deliberate, his hand never far from the revolver at his hip. Not because he expected violence, but because it reminded him of who he had become. Up close he could see the bruises of life on her face, not the kind left by fists, but the deeper ones, hunger hollowing her cheeks, sleepless nights dimming her eyes. The child clutched her hand with fierce determination, a thin girl of maybe 6, her dress clean but threadbare, eyes too large for her face, watching Daniel as if he were the last gate between her and survival. The woman swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her daughter's, and then she said the words that would split his life into before and after. "Hire me for one night, please. My daughter is starving." She didn't cry when she said it. She didn't beg beyond that single sentence. She simply stood there, dignity trembling like a candle flame in a storm. Daniel felt something twist in his chest, sharp and unwelcome. He had heard propositions before, crude ones tossed in saloons, desperate ones whispered in back alleys during cattle drives. This was different. This was a mother offering herself not out of desire, not even shame, but arithmetic, one night traded for food, warmth, maybe another week of breathing. He looked at the child again and saw not manipulation but truth. Starvation leaves a signature no lie can imitate. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of judgment press in from every direction. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gruff, stripped of softness by habit. "May," she said, then gestured to the girl. "This is Lynn." The name sounded fragile in the wide American air, like porcelain set on stone. Daniel turned away abruptly, walking toward the house, not trusting his face to remain neutral if he looked at them any longer. He told himself he was doing the sensible thing, that he would give them food, maybe money, and send them on. That was the clean way. That was the way that didn't ask anything of his heart. Inside, the house smelled of coffee and old wood, of a life lived alone for too long. He moved, pulling bread from the pantry, slicing meat, filling a tin cup with milk he'd skimmed that morning. When he returned, he held the bundle out without meeting May's eyes. "Take this," he said. "You don't owe me anything." For a moment, relief flickered across her face, but it died almost instantly, replaced by something harder, more determined. She shook her head. "Thank you," she said softly, "but I must earn it. I cannot take charity, Daniel frowned, irritation rising to mask the unease beneath. You don't have to earn food for a kid, he snapped. That's not how it works. May's grip on Lynn's hand tightened. Where I come from, she replied. It is exactly how it works. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. Lynn looked from her mother to Daniel, her small face pinched with hunger and hope. And in that moment Daniel understood something that frightened him. He could walk away, and the world would not stop him. No law would drag him back. No ghost would rise to judge him. The choice was entirely his, and that made it heavier than any obligation. He cursed under his breath, rubbing a hand over his face. You're not staying the night, he said finally. Not like that. May's shoulders sagged, but she did not argue. She simply nodded as if she had expected refusal all along. Daniel looked at the sky, already darkening, and then back at the road that led nowhere fast. You can stay in the bunkhouse, he added, the words surprising even himself. Both of you. You can work tomorrow if you want. There's plenty to do. May's eyes filled then, not with tears that spilled, but with something like light breaking through clouds. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of gratitude so deep it made Daniel uncomfortable. Thank you, she said, voice steady despite the tremor beneath. Lynn tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering something in Chinese that Daniel didn't understand, but felt all the same. He led them across the yard to the bunkhouse, explaining rules he barely remembered making, his tone firm, controlled, as though this were just another business decision. Inside, the bunkhouse was simple but warm. A stove glowing faintly, blankets folded on narrow beds. May helped Lynn sit, offering her food first, watching every bite like a prayer answered. Daniel turned away again, giving them space, telling himself he was done, that this was where the story ended. Yet as he stepped back into the cold, the ranch felt different, as if the land itself were holding its breath. He had not hired a woman for one night. He had opened a door he had spent 10 years barricading shut. And somewhere deep inside, a part of him he thought long dead stirred, uneasy, alert, and dangerously alive. Morning came without ceremony on the Hart Ranch, the sun dragging itself up over the horizon like it. Two questioned the value of another day. Daniel was already awake, as he always was, seated at the small kitchen table with a mug of black, coffee cooling between his hands. He hadn't slept much. Every creak of the house, every shift of the wind had pulled him halfway out of uneasy dreams where faces he didn't recognize kept asking him for things he didn't know how to give. He told himself it was foolish. He had given a woman and her child a warm place and food. Nothing more, but the lie didn't sit right. Through the window, he could see the bunkhouse door still closed. Thin smoke curling from its chimney, proof that the stove inside had been kept burning through the night. He finished his coffee and stood, shrugging into his jacket, deciding that work would settle his mind the way it always did. The ranch did not care about conscience. Cattle needed feeding, fences needed checking. The land demanded motion, not thought. He was halfway to the barn when he heard footsteps behind him, light but purposeful. Mee stood a few yards away, Lynn beside her, both freshly washed, their clothes the same but cleaner somehow, as if effort alone could restore dignity. Mee bowed her head slightly, then straightened. "Good morning, Mr. Hart," she said. "Please tell me what work I should do." Daniel studied her for a moment, irritation and admiration tangling in his chest. Most people who arrived desperate tried to look smaller, weaker, hoping to inspire pity. May stood like someone who expected to earn her place or be dismissed, and would accept either without complaint. "This isn't a hotel," he said gruffly. "Work here is hard." "I'm not afraid of hard," she replied simply. He nodded toward the barn. "Fine, you can start by helping clean stalls. There's feed to carry, too. Your kid stays out of the—" Lynn opened her mouth to protest, but May shook her head gently, crouching to speak softly to her in Chinese. The girl's shoulders slumped, disappointment flickering across her face. But she nodded, obedient even in hunger. Daniel felt that twist again, sharper this time. He turned away before it could soften him. The hours that followed were filled with the familiar rhythm of labor, but something was off. May worked without pause, her movements efficient despite her smaller frame. Hauling buckets, scrubbing boards, her breath steady, even when sweat darkened the collar of her coat. She did not complain. She did not ask for breaks. When Daniel corrected her, she listened carefully, adjusting without resentment. Lynn sat on an upturned crate near the barn door, watching everything with solemn intensity, hands folded in her lap like a tiny overseer. At midday, Daniel brought out sandwiches and set them down without ceremony. Lynn reached for hers immediately, but May gently pulled it back, insisting the child eat first, watching until every crumb was gone before touching her own. Daniel pretended not to notice, but the image lodged itself somewhere deep. "You didn't say where you're from," he said abruptly, more to break the silence than out of genuine curiosity. May wiped her hands on her apron. "Guangdong," she replied. "A small village. My husband came to America first. He worked in a meat plant." Her voice did not waver, but something tightened around the words. "He died?" Daniel asked. May nodded once. "An accident. The company sent a letter. No money. No body?" Lynn looked up then, confusion flickering across her face, as if death were still an unfinished sentence to her. Daniel grunted, unsure what response was expected. He had lost people too, but loss spoke different languages in different mouths. The afternoon wore on, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the fields. By evening, May's hands were raw, her shoulders stiff, yet she stood straighter than she had the day before, as if work itself had fed her something more sustaining than bread. Daniel told them to wash up and come to the house for supper, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. May hesitated. "We can eat in the bunkhouse," she said quickly. "We do not want to disturb you." "You're already here," he replied, sharper than intended. "Might as well do it right." The house felt smaller with other people in it. Every sound amplified, the scrape of a chair, Lynn's soft gasp at the sight of a real table. May's quiet thank you murmured like a blessing. Daniel served stew, thick with meat and potatoes, watching as Lynn ate with careful enthusiasm, her manners precise despite her hunger. May ate slowly, eyes downcast, as if wary that comfort might vanish if acknowledged too openly. Afterward, Lynn fell asleep at the table, her head resting on her folded arms. May moved to lift her, but Daniel waved her off, carrying the child himself with an awkward gentleness that surprised them both. Lynn stirred, but did not wake, her small hand clutching his shirt instinctively. The weight of her was light, too light, and it stirred a protectiveness Daniel hadn't felt since before the world had taught him better. He laid her on the bunkhouse bed and stepped back, suddenly aware of how quiet everything was. Outside, night had settled in thick and cold. May stood in the doorway watching him, gratitude and something like fear mingling in her eyes. "You are very kind," she said. Daniel shook his head. "Don't mistake decency for kindness," he replied. "This is temporary." May nodded, accepting the boundary without argument. "Everything is temporary," she said softly. As Daniel walked back toward the house, her words followed him, echoing against the emptiness he had learned to call peace. He told himself again that this was nothing, that he was simply doing what any man should. Yet when he lay awake later, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of the wind, he knew the truth he refused to name. The ranch was no longer just his, and whatever came next would not be so easily controlled. The third day began with snow, light at first, drifting down like indecision before thickening into something that erased the horizon. Daniel watched it from the window while pulling on his gloves, calculating feed, shelter, and the added burden of 2 extra mouths when winter hadn't yet decided whether to be merciful or cruel. He told himself that he would send them on soon, give May a few dollars, enough supplies to reach the next town, but the thought felt less like a plan and more like a postponement of guilt. Outside, the world had narrowed to what could be seen and touched, and inside that narrowing, choices became heavier. May was already up, sweeping the bunkhouse steps free of snow, her breath fogging the air, Lynn beside her trying to imitate the motion with a broom nearly as tall as she was. Daniel frowned. "She doesn't need to work," he called out. May paused, then shook her head. "She needs to learn," she said, "and she wants to help." Lynn nodded vigorously, pride brightening her thin face. Daniel said nothing more, but he handed Lynn a pair of old gloves that swallowed her hands, pretending not to notice the way her smile lingered long after. The storm worsened by noon, forcing Daniel to bring the cattle in early. May followed his instructions carefully, moving among the animals with quiet confidence that surprised him. There was no fear in her, only respect, as if she understood that survival meant listening more than commanding. At one point, a skittish calf broke loose, bolting toward the open gate. Without hesitation, May stepped into its path, arms wide, voice low and steady in Chinese. Words Daniel didn't understand, but felt calm the animal all the same. The calf slowed, then stopped, trembling. Daniel stared, unsettled. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. May shrugged. "Animals are the same. Everywhere," she said. "They know when someone means harm." The words landed harder than she intended. The storm forced an early end to work, and by late afternoon, the road beyond the ranch had vanished under drifting white. Daniel stood on the porch, scanning the distance, knowing what the weather meant. No travel, no leaving. Whatever decision he'd been avoiding had been made for him by the sky. Inside, the house felt warmer than usual, the stove working overtime. Lynn sat on the floor with a box of old photographs. Daniel hadn't meant to bring out images of cattle, land, and one faded picture of a woman with a laugh, frozen in time. Lynn pointed. "Mama?" she asked hopefully. Daniel swallowed. "No," he said quietly. "That was my wife." Lynn considered this, then nodded solemnly. "She looks kind," she said. The simplicity of the statement cracked something in him. He stood behind Lynn, eyes fixed on the photograph, understanding without explanation. That night, as the wind howled and snow rattled against the windows, May finally told him the rest, not because he asked, but because the storm had stripped pretense away. She spoke of the promises her husband had believed, of letters that stopped coming, of landlords who did not care about grief, only rent. She spoke of men who offered help with conditions. Of the night, she ran with Lynn in her arms rather than pay the price demanded. When she finished, she did not look at Daniel, as if awaiting judgment would be too much to bear. The room was silent except for the fire. Daniel felt anger rise, not at May, but at a world that forced arithmetic on love. "You won't be hired for one night," he said finally, his voice low and certain. "Not here. Not ever." May looked up then, startled, tears finally spilling. Not in humiliation, but relief so deep it shook her. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the Hart Ranch house, something had shifted. The boundary Daniel had drawn was still there, but it had changed shape, from a wall meant to keep people out into a line meant to keep them safe. Chapter 1 closed not with answers, but with a truth neither of them yet dared to say aloud. Survival had brought them together, but something far more dangerous, hope, was beginning to take root. Spring arrived the way forgiveness does, quietly, almost suspiciously, after too much pain to be trusted right away. The snow retreated inch by inch, revealing land that looked scarred but alive, and Daniel found himself measuring time differently now, not by seasons alone but by the small, human moments that had taken root in his days. Lynn learned to read from old ranch ledgers and newspaper scraps, sounding out words at the kitchen table while May cooked or mended, her voice steady, patient, filling the house with something warmer than heat. May had become essential without ever demanding to be. She knew the rhythms of the ranch now, anticipated needs before Daniel spoke them, and still carried herself as though she were a guest who might be asked to leave at any moment. That unspoken tension lingered between them, a fragile thing neither dared to touch directly. It finally broke the day the letter came. Daniel found it tucked into the mailbox like an accusation, stamped with government seals and words that carried the cold authority of law, immigration review, possible removal. May stood silently as he read, her face pale but composed, the same composure she had worn the night she first stood at his gate. Lynn sensed the shift immediately, clinging to her mother's leg, eyes wide with fear she didn't yet have language for. Daniel felt something harden inside him, not anger, not pity, but resolve. "They're not taking you," he said. surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Mee shook her head slowly. "You cannot fight the system," she said. "I have tried before." Daniel looked around the house, the worn table now etched with crayon marks, the stove that never went cold, the ranch that no longer echoed when he walked through it, and realized the truth he had been avoiding. "Then I won't let them call it charity," he replied. "We'll give them something they can't ignore." The process was ugly, slow and unforgiving, filled with interviews that dredged up old wounds and paperwork that treated love like a suspicious transaction. Daniel spoke when May's English faltered, not over her but beside her, grounding her when fear threatened to undo her. Lynn waited outside offices, clutching his hand, her trust absolute and terrifying. Neighbors noticed. Whispers followed. Some were kind, others cruel, reminding Daniel that compassion often comes with a social cost. One night, after Lynn had fallen asleep, May finally spoke the words that had hovered between them for months. "I never wanted you to think I stayed because I needed you," she said softly. "I stayed because I chose to." Daniel met her gaze, his voice rough with truth. "I never wanted you to think I helped because I expected something," he said. "I did it because losing you would feel like losing my home." The honesty between them settled not like fireworks, but like a foundation. Months later, the decision came through: temporary protection, work authorization, a path forward narrow but real. Mee cried openly this time, holding Lynn so tightly the child laughed through tears. Daniel stood apart for a moment, overwhelmed by a joy he hadn't earned but had fought to keep. The ranch thrived that summer, not because the land had changed, but because the hands tending it moved with purpose and care. Lynn ran through the fields without fear. Her laughter carried on the same wind that once only howled. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the plains gold, May stood beside Daniel on the porch, the place where everything had begun. "That night," she said quietly, "I thought I was selling myself to keep my daughter alive." Daniel shook his head. "You were fighting," he replied, "and you reminded me how." He reached for her hand, not as an offer, not as a rescue, but as a promise freely chosen. She took it. The ranch remained remote, the world still imperfect and often cruel, but within those fences, something rare had been built, not from desperation alone, but from dignity preserved, compassion earned, and love that arrived not like thunder but like dawn.